Once upon a time, in the year 1894, before cell phones and sliced bread, in the land of the Far East, like a really big land, there lived a city of people cozied up in the finest winter gear money could buy, ruled for 300 years by the Romanov dynasty. The rest of the land, of course, was a giant expanse of frozen, relatively crappy tundra. Prince Nicholas II was about to be crowned as Tsar Nicholas II. He had witnessed his grandfather be slain by revolutionary terrorists as a child, and, understandably, was determined to keep himself safe from any sort of repeat. Little did he know, he wouldn't actually live long enough to see sliced bread, and would be the last Tsar of Russia. 7 years earlier, a young person named Alexander Ulyanov was hanged for attempted assassination of the Tsar, who at that time was Nicholas's dad. Ulyanov's younger brother, Vladimir Lenin, plotted for revenge against the Tsar. Lenin spent his time studying notes and writings of revolutionary authors, and was particularly moved by the works of a German scientist, philosopher, mall Santa, and politician, Karl Marx. Lenin drew parallels between the ideas presented in Marx's books, namely the Communist Manifesto, and Russia's political and social environment. He felt a Marxist-style revolution would benefit Russia, and composed radical articles on the subject. These actions are what ended up costing him his stay in Russia. He was arrested and kicked out to Siberia for 4 years, but that ended up helping him, because they kicked everyone out to Siberia, so he could go and talk to all the other people they kicked out. In 1904, Russia entered a war with Japan. Many people in Russia were not particularly happy with that. Wars are bad. Nicholas mismanaged the money, soldiers were not well prepared, and they lost the war only a year later in 1905. The country's economy, which was already not doing well, fell completely into despair. Food shortages emerged, there were riots, the poor were hungry and lacking in necessities, and the middle classes wanted representation in their government so that they could tell their government not to get in more wars. In January of 1905, thousands of workers and civilians marched through St. Petersburg towards the Winter Palace in hopes of inspiring the kinder nature of Tsar Nicholas II's heart to support striking workers and starving people. Instead of justice or talking, the Tsar's guards opened fire on the crowd. Yay. Chaos and panic ensued, people fled and actually trampled other people underfoot while they were running away, and the guardsmen continued to rush with their swords and guns. Once the commotion settled, there were hundreds of bodies and they stained the snow with blood, hence the name Bloody Sunday. The year 1905 wasn't all bad though, kinda. Nicholas survived the Day of Blood and promises people that he would create the Duma, which was pretty much a Russian Congress where people would elect delegates. The problem with this came in August of 1905 when people found out the actual specifics of the Duma, such as the fact that the people in the Duma could only be members of nobility and middle class. The only peasants who could actually join were people who supported the Zemstvos, which were small units that were self-governed sort of in Russia, kinda. That meant that none of the industrial workers or minorities or the people who actually fought to get the Duma would actually get a say in the Duma. The people were really angry and protests broke out across Russia yet again. This became the biggest strike in Russian history, which caused a lot of places like factories, hospitals, newspapers, and other businesses to just shut down. When October of 1905 came, Russia was almost too far gone. Tsar Nicholas II also decided that World War I was a great idea, and joined in the rest of Europe in sitting in a bunch of really long holes in the ground shooting at each other for 4 years. Skip a bit later, and by most accounts, Russia had been in the First World War for way too long. They depleted their resources of both food and men, not only on the front lines, but also within the nation, and the Germans had them completely outmanned and outgunned. The longer they stayed in the war, the worse they did. Supplies of bread became so scarce that Nicholas had to pass laws limiting the amount of bread people could buy in a state where people were already starving. Those in higher classes that controlled the land decided, hey, let's drastically increase the cost of bread. So the peasants were not that happy. There were riots, both peaceful and violent, again, and even the middle class had begun to rebel and began forming unions. The people had entirely lost faith in the Tsar, and Nicholas was in danger of being attacked. People despised him. In fact, they wanted him dead. The Tsar as we said before, entirely disregarded the Duma, the parliament that was meant to keep people calm. As people lost faith in the government, they actually just stopped doing their jobs. Almost 100,000 people gathered in the streets of Petrograd to protest. Both men and women partook in the demonstrations, which I guess. The protesters battled the police and then burnt and destroyed multiple police stations. As they became increasingly violent, the Russian government decided that the way to solve violence is more violence. A small army was sent in to settle them, and in many cases opened fire on protesters. The people on strike stood fast and basically set the small opposing force back on its heels because they were scared of the massive amount of people who were relatively inclined to violence. The garrisons then joined the protesters and shot their own officers after Tsar Nicholas decided to just get rid of the Duma entirely. These guys turned against their own government to stand for the right reason. The government finally shut down as the dynastic family backed off and the provisional government was formed. After the Romanovs were gone and kept under the eye of the new government, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, remember him, returned to Russia in April and tried to rally some support from the people, saying communism was the solution to everything and all that. The leader of the provisional government, Kerensky, also took over the position of war minister and launched more attacks on the Austro-Hungarians, which resulted in many Russian fatalities and furthered the loss of trust in the Russian government. These occurrences, compiled on each other, were just enough to start another sub-revolution called the October Revolution. By the October Revolution, the provisional government is not very popular. Despite massive poverty, debt, wage decreases, and the threat of actual national bankruptcy, these guys decided continuing the war with the rest of Europe was a great way to use the negative 50 million rubles they had saved up. Thus, World War I still continued. Massive strikes and anti-war demonstrations were enough to get Kerensky just a little bit paranoid. Petrograd basically went from bad to worse, and Kerensky was like, "Yo, Krymov, get over here, dude. Petrograd's a garbage hole right now." Krymov, one of his prominent generals, responded with a resounding "yi" and began to move a large section of the Russian army to keep order in the capital. However, Kerensky's aforementioned paranoia led him to actually reverse the order to make sure there was nobody in the city with the power to actually stage a coup. Turns out he should have been more worried about Kornilov, another officer. Or maybe he was confused over their names. Kornilov saw that the government was basically going down in flames and went to put them out of their misery. However, Kerensky, along with the Bolsheviks, some revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks, managed to get him to calm down. But at this point, the government is in a pretty bad spot, and the Bolshevik Politburo decided that it was time for a commie coup. The Bolsheviks were nothing if not organized. They managed to slowly make sure that most of the city was with them, or at least neutral. And while Kerensky was aware that they were preparing, he wasn't really in a position to do anything about it, because the provisional government wasn't very functional. The Bolsheviks didn't really even bother to hide anyway. They were pretty confident that everything was going down in flames anyway, and they might as well speed it up. On October 25th, 1917, a small fleet of destroyers and other small boats showed up in the Petrograd harbor and declared they were siding with the Bolshevik insurrection. The Bolsheviks then went to work and seized the city from the inside. Even Petrograd's own armies defected in large numbers, leaving Kerensky not only powerless in that his government was both basically non-functional, but also in that most of his military had just popped onto the other side. Rather than try and fight the communists, he stole a car from the American embassy and ditched, seeing as the railroads were run by the Bolsheviks and he couldn't actually ride out the normal way. After he left, Lenin put out a proclamation basically saying, "Yo guys, we won." The next day, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. Contrary to how that sounds, there wasn't very much storming. The October Revolution was relatively bloodless. They basically just walked in, the provisional government gave them the government. In fact, the only reason they even waited that long is because they wanted to avoid some of the artillery that had been consolidated near the palace, but lucky for them, a group of the guards actually ran off and took the artillery with them, and another large group left the palace to go hide in the barracks. While the government tried to figure out what even to do with their army slowly just running away and Lenin closing in, Lenin just shot him the good old surrender or die bit and then took over. Congress actually legally ratified the revolt, though the right and center wing dudes left because they said that power was seized illegally and they would have no part in ratifying this revolution. In their defense, power was actually seized illegally. Leon Trotsky, one of the big Bolshevik dudes threw some shade back with a pretty cool quote. "You are pitiful, isolated individuals. You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, in the dustbin of history." For a bit, Lenin tried to actually have a democratically elected government in charge of his new communist state, but stopped doing that once he realized that democratically elected meant that he didn't actually get to choose who won elections, and that wasn't quite in line with his idea of government. Once all that democratic capitalist nonsense was gone, he could finally implement the ultimate case of it works on paper, communist society. He took everyone's land, money, and stuff and redistributed it around the country. He seized the means of production, literally, he took control of the factories, and told everyone that Russia owed money to that he wouldn't pay any of them. However, he also shortened the workday and raised wages. For all of his flaws, and he had plenty, he did actually want to create a communist state. Like, there was a certain amount of principle. Unfortunately, his political rivals, the Mensheviks, were not big fans of them. A civil war happened, but in 1922, Lenin won. The revolution brought a wave of interest in improving technology, industrial towns started popping up, and people worked towards getting widespread electricity and other technological advancements into Russia that they had sort of fallen behind on. The innovative push also inspired a futuristic artist movement, including machine motifs, geometric and pointed art, and ballets and music and poetry projecting a bright future for the new communist Russia. In 1924, Lenin died in his really, really big mansion, which wasn't exactly equal housing with the common folk, which would be the communist thing to do, but technicalities. Anyway, before he died, Lenin threw some shade at his main political rival, Joseph Stalin, who you may know, and Lenin was a little bit worried about him. When Lenin died, though, Stalin managed to either win over or kill, mostly kill, the rest of the people who opposed him and suppress all of Lenin's complaints. Since the Cold War is an entirely different subject, albeit a far more interesting one, the story ends here, and they all lived happily ever after. Except not happily, because Stalin was infamous for massive amounts of human rights abuses, and they didn't all live because he killed like 20 million people over the course of several political purges and wars, and it wasn't really ever after because the USSR fell in 1991. So not really at all. This isn't a very uplifting story, unfortunately. The end.